Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today, we wanted to talk a little bit about testing, about that process we go through towards the end of developing something where we try and take it from mostly working to actually working or fully working. And this is particularly relevant and interesting for me at this point because I am in that very final of phases for my next app, the one we talked about a little bit about last week. That I'm in the phase now where functionally and from a feature perspective, I've kind of drawn the line and said, this is the app. This is as far as I'm going to go with it. Any other features or any other things that come up are going to be in the next version, version 1.1, or I'll push it down the road. All I'm now going to be doing is fixing bugs and testing and finding all the little issues and problems. And it seemed like something that would be an interesting topic to kind of walk through, because ultimately the goal is to make sure that we ship things that are, quality, are not, riddled with bugs or having all kinds of problems. And it's a tricky thing, I think, especially from an indie perspective. And I think it's probably fair to say, but I'm definitely talking about this from the more of the indie perspective, rather than, if you are in a large corporate environment where your app is being worked on by lots of different people, you may actually have an entire QA department whose job it is to test your application. When a job I used to work at, there's a room full of probably 20 people who all day just sat there using the product, testing it, trying all the crazy edges, and they had these big test plans that they had to go through before we did a build. And that is a very different world than I think either of us work in. And so we're not talking about that kind of testing. That is a discipline unto itself. It is useful and important, but for an independent, I think that's just not the reality, both from a resources perspective. I don't have the time to realistically do that, to do 20 people times 40 hours a week of testing. That's just impossible. And also, I'm not sure if it's necessary. And some of this is coming into there's a certain category of bug that I'm less worried about. This is sort of the integration bug rather than the functional bug, where sometimes you just have bugs that come up because you had 5 people working on a product and there, one person changed something here, someone else changed it over there. And obviously myself in different time domains is different. I can be, 2 weeks ago me and my current me can be conflicting, but that happens less often. But either way, being independent, it's still something that I have to do. And it's a process that I go through now. And it seems like kind of a good thing to walk through. But I don't do it in a formal way. Marco, do you do it any kind of formal testing or processes that you have around putting something out, or do you just kind of try it out a bunch and see if it works?
I mostly just try out a bunch. I mean, and so we should clarify also that test-driven development is not what we're really talking about. Neither of us really do that. We've talked about it briefly before, and I don't think either of us really has a strong opinion on it, except just to say that we don't do it mostly as a choice because of our resources and our style of coding. Of just being single-person shops, it makes it harder to justify the additional amount of time it takes to write all the tests for test-driven development. So that's not what we're talking about here today, at least. So when it comes to whatever testing people would call what we used to call testing. So just you or other people actually just using your app and trying out all the different things, testing out edge cases, the things that a good tester or QA person would do. That's what we're talking about today. And so my answer to that is generally I mostly rely on my own usage and reports from beta testers in order to do this. And this has pluses and minuses. I mean, obviously, this is a less disciplined approach than having a formal unit testing process, a formal UI testing process, having dedicated testing people or services. I should look more into those things. I haven't to date, and it mostly has not caused problems. And part of this is because of the way I developed the app in the first place. I mean, step number one is I only make apps that I use. If you are making an app that you don't use yourself on a regular basis. And there's lots of reasons why you might want to do this. If you're a consultant, obviously that's a big one. But so lots of people have these needs. If that's the kind of need that you're working with where you don't use the app, I really don't know what to tell you. I think things like unit testing make more sense there, or having like dedicated QA people or services that you can hire to do that. But because I use the app myself, and I also tend to only implement features that I will use. And this is not... I don't do that 100% of the time. Like, there are certain features, like in my nitpicky details feature about showing the number of unplayed episodes as a red badge on the icon of the app. I think you can tell by the description text in that interface that I don't want to use this feature. But enough people requested it, and it was a small enough feature. I mean, that feature is something like 4 lines of code. It's a very, very, very tiny little feature, and it satisfied large user demand. A lot of people requested that feature always before I added it. And so it satisfied a large user demand. It was not that much work to do, and it's very easy for me to test every so often, even though I don't use it myself. So that's something I added anyway, despite not using it myself. But otherwise, I try not to add features that I won't use myself very often, if at all, in part because I don't care, and in part because it makes it harder for me to maintain the quality of the app, because I won't see problems in day-to-day testing. Like one of the issues that I faced recently is I have a pretty severe CarPlay bug in the most recent build, and I'm working on fixing that. And I should have it for the next one, but I don't have a CarPlay vehicle. We don't own a CarPlay vehicle in our household, and we actually are about to get one in about a month, and that'll probably help. Although it won't be my car, which is unfortunate, but at least my wife will have one, so I will have hardware to test on sometimes. But like CarPlay is this whole area of the app that I never see because I don't drive a car that's CarPlay enabled. And so there are going to be all these different areas where my own day-to-day usage is not going to cover it, or is not going to reveal subtle problems, at least. And so for those kind of uses, I really just rely on beta testers and reports from users. Hopefully it's before I release these versions that have problems, but sometimes they get out there. And so in order to minimize the damage, I do try to at least cover the biggest, most common uses of the app in my own formal or informal testing. So, for example, when I'm releasing a big version, I will almost always, if I remember to, which isn't always the case, which is a problem, but I should probably, this is like one of the reasons why it might be useful to have like a checklist or something, but, or, a more formal structure of doing these things, or an automated way of doing these things. But one of the things I do in my app is, to basically start from a brand new user every time I do a release. So like, take a device that doesn't have the app on it, install a fresh version of the app, and then try creating a new account and starting all over again. And this helps for a number of reasons. Obviously, that's a very important thing for your app to make sure it works at all. And then secondly, it shows me the onboarding experience. It shows me the first run experience a lot. Like I see that whenever I do a release, I will see the first run experience at least once during that process. So that kind of helps remind me of any shortcomings in it, or it helps show me if anything's broken about it, or if things aren't quite right. So that's nice, in that way as well. But this is all a very long way of saying basically the way I do testing is I just use the app a lot myself before I let anybody else use it. And then when it gets close to release, I do beta tests. And I can talk a little bit more about that maybe a little bit later, but the beta tests I use tend to find almost any of the remaining problems.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say, like, I think my testing strategy is very similar to yours. I use the app a lot, and I try and sort of use it, like, as I get closer, I tend to kind of use it slightly in anger. Like, I use it in a way that is kind of trying to break it. Like, I'm bashing on all the buttons, and like, what if I change this setting really quickly, back and forth? Like, is anything weird going to happen? Like, you can use it in that way. And then, yeah, like you said, it's that kind of testing where, and honestly, what I usually do is for the, like, trying out a new user, testing, it's I currently use an iPhone 7. That's the phone that I use, like, during development. Like 98% of my development happens on that phone. And so before I launch, I need to, at the very least run it, on like a 5S and on a 7 Plus. just in terms of to make sure that there's not any weird UI bugs or issues, or sometimes even just weird. There's performance things, obviously. If you go back to like a 5 or a 5S, they're much slower, and so I find a great place to do the kind of onboard testing, because I'm starting fresh on those devices half the time anyway. Though I will also say one thing that has bitten me many, many times in the past, and so now I always try and make sure I do too, is I do the fresh user onboarding experience process, but I do that running the old version of the app, like the existing, like I go to the App Store and download whatever the current version of the app is from the App Store, onboard a fresh user, and then install the version that I'm trying to verify and test with.
Nice.
Because often what I've found is there's issues that you can run into that, like usually it's a data issue or a settings issue or something that isn't being translated over correctly. And obviously the majority of your users are going to be, are coming from that previous version and then running your new version. And so if there's any issues there, you want to catch them. But this kind of approach of just taking a lot of devices, like on my desk, I have a bunch of different, all the different iPhones. Like I never sell an iPhone whenever I get a new one. And so I have all the different testing devices available to me that way. Similarly, like right now, I'm wearing 2 Apple Watches. I have a 38 millimeter Apple Watch on my right hand and a 42 millimeter Apple Watch on my left hand, and they're paired to separate phones, running 7 sizes, and I'm just running the app that I'm testing constantly now. Like I just keep this process of kind of banging up against it. And if in general, I think like you said, it's amazing how good the coverage you can get from that kind of a informal, but, like constant high volume testing. Like maybe it's not as rigorous, and so it loses something there, but it definitely benefits from just doing it all the time. And if you build apps that you use, you certainly have that benefit, at the very least, of exposure to it.
Yeah, I mean, one other note on the devices before I forget. App Review does not seem to test much, if at all, on a variety of devices. As far as I can tell, they test on one device only, and usually it's a recent one. So as far as I can tell, so like a lot of times people will have issues where like they'll get an update into the store approved that like crashes on launch on the iPhone 5S or something like that, right? Because it's like an older device that is still supported and that it still runs on and that your customers might still use, but it doesn't work for, an App Review didn't catch it, and so you can't depend on App Review to catch like the big obvious crashers, because if it happens on any conditions that they're not trying, including any other device besides whatever one they happen to be using, you're not going to have a good time. So that's very, very important to note.
Yeah, and it's also probably worth saying that App Review is not QA. Like App Review is this very like coarse sieve that every now and then will catch problems, and I love it when they do this. But like that is not at all what they're doing. They're not really looking to test your app to find problems. They're kind of running it through at a very different level. And so it certainly isn't one of those like, well, I'll just see if App Review can find any bugs, and if they don't, then I'm sure it's fine. Like that would be a terrible approach to take with your app.
Yeah, it's like the seatbelt on a plane. It's like that is not the safety mechanism you should be relying on. You should definitely if App Review rejects your app for a crash, you have a serious problem in your QA process. Like whatever you submit to App Review should not be in that kind of state where it would crash in like the first 4 minutes of somebody using it once, But overall, like, and I should also, suggest too that if you are going to rely so heavily as we do on self-testing, basically, and again, I apologize greatly to people who enjoy formal testing and automated testing and unit testing and 100% test coverage. I apologize because this entire discussion must be driving you totally crazy. Hi, Casey. But ultimately, it's hard for single-person developers to really justify the additional time and or expense that more rigorous testing methods bring on for things like this. So now, that's a lot of qualifiers in that sentence. Obviously, if you have a larger staff, if you have a lot of money, if your app is more important than like a sleep tracker for your wrist, or for a podcast player. Like if really bad things happen, if you like lose people's important data, or somebody will be seriously put out or hurt if your app breaks, obviously that's a place where you need a more formal testing procedure and framework in place. But most people who make iOS apps aren't working in that kind of capacity, and not only don't have those resources, but it would actually be kind of a bad way to spend resources, basically like tripling all of your work. And this is a huge debate in programmer circles of whether test-driven development is really more work, or whether it ends up saving you more work in the long run. I honestly don't care which one of those it is. I think it's probably unknowable, because it's probably like the answer, like everything else, is probably it depends. But ultimately, this isn't the way we do things, and I think there's a lot of developers out there who do things more like what we do. Anyway, that being said, one more thing before I go into the sponsor for the week, and that is that if you're relying so much on self-testing as we do, if your app has like different modes or settings or ways you can do things, change it up. Like in your day-to-day usage, change it up every so often and spend a lot of time in each kind of condition. So for instance, Overcast has dark mode or light mode, and during development, I usually switch about once a week between which one of those I'm using, because I want to kind of get used to it and live in it and make sure that I'm designing and making the best app I can for both of those things. Same thing with streaming versus downloading. Like, I wrote this whole streaming engine and I hardly ever use it, and that's kind of a problem. So basically, I force myself to change my own preference and spend a good amount of time, like a week or a month, in streaming mode in the middle of development cycles where I would otherwise be in downloading mode. Just to make sure I'm getting a really good idea of like these vastly different modes that my app can be in, so that my own testing is more effective. Anyway, we're sponsored this week by Pingdom. Pingdom can help remove the need for you to have somebody who automatically logs into your website every minute and refreshes it to make sure it's up, because Pingdom does that automatically with their testing framework. See for yourself at pingdom.com/radar. Pingdom is an awesome monitoring service for websites and web services. And when you use offer code RADAR at checkout, you get a holiday special of 50% off your first invoice. This is an awesome deal, usually at 20%. Now it's 50% for the holidays. So check it out at pingdom.com/radar. Pingdom offers powerful, easy-to-use monitoring tools and services for your website and web servers. Websites are very sophisticated these days, and you need to, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong, and they know this. They see it because they monitor it for lots of people. You need Pingdom to be monitoring your site. They can monitor as often as every minute by requesting pages, by running through checkouts, by logging in, by doing, transactions. Like, they can do all sorts of things, all simulated from their more than 70 global test servers. And they can do that as often as once a minute. And if anything goes down, they can alert you via so many different means, whatever you want. You can have email, text, push notification, or any combination of these things, and you can set the granularity. It's incredibly customizable. I've been using Pingdom now for, I think 8 years, 9 years, something crazy. It's a very long time, because I've used it way before they were a sponsor, way before I was even a podcaster. I was using Pingdom to monitor Tumblr back in the day, and I just love them. I use them constantly. Highly recommended that you use Pingdom for all your monitoring needs. It is really the best, and if you run any kind of website or web service, the last thing you want is for strangers on Twitter to be telling you when your site is down when you didn't already know that. Like, you do not want to be learning that from Twitter. You want to know when your site is down. You want to be the first to know, and then you want to be able to go in and fix it before all the people on Twitter see it and start bugging you about it. And with Pingdom, you can, because Pingdom will alert you the moment things go down with that up to 1 minute granularity. That's really incredible, and they are so fast and so reliable. I love Pingdom. Check them out yourself. Go to pingdom.com/radar. You will get a 14-day free trial. And when you enter offer code RADAR at checkout, you will get a holiday special of 50% off your first invoice. Check it out today, and you'll be the first to know when your site is down. Thank you very much to Pingdom for sponsoring our show.
So I think for the last part of the show, it seemed like something that may actually make sense for us to focus in on is a bit of the actual, the details of what this kind of user testing approach that we've just been talking about looks like. And for me, what that usually means is, so I get into this phase now where I'm doing this final level of testing, and I'm just constantly trying to think of things to try. I'm trying them out. I'm using the app in different circumstances, in different places. Like I'll be using it on different networks. Like, hey, I'm out on a cell network. I'm at home. And so whenever I find an issue, inevitably you'll find a bug. You'll see something that you're like, that's a little interesting. What I found is a very important thing is to have some kind of reliable way of collecting all these little issues and bugs and problems. For me, usually that is I'll have a list in OmniFocus that I am just adding items to. And so anytime I see something, usually I'll grab a screenshot of it. And if it's obvious, I'll just attach the screenshot to the task in OmniFocus, or if not, I'll take it and run it through what used to be an app that you made, Marco, which used to be called Bugshot, what I think is now called Pinpoint, which is a great little tool. We can have a link in the show notes to it, but it's just a little thing for just drawing arrows, basically, or circling things. It's great for screenshot, sort of when you're like, there's this weird graphics glitch or something. And so you can mark it up, add it to a ticket. And then, I go through all of, like, when I'm in the phase now, like this morning, I sat down, I had a list of about 5 or 6 little bugs I've noticed yesterday. I went through and I'm just knocking them out. And it's kind of like this, I work all the way down till I have no bugs, and then I make a build, and then I go through the process again. And you kind of just keep cycling through, collecting as you go. And for me, that kind of process of just keeping this running log, seems to work well. I like doing it that way rather than kind of, having, like, sitting down and just testing for hours never really works for me. I find that I get kind of bored, or I start doing the same patterns over and over again. And so it's better, I think, for me, I'd try and spread it out throughout the day. And obviously, if it's an application that you would use normally and naturally throughout the day, then this makes it easier. But otherwise, you just kind of have to sort of remind yourself to do it. And this is also a little bit tricky if you have an app that requires a certain amount of time for testing. So, like, for example, I have a sleep tracker. Like, in order for it to really, like I cannot compress beyond just running it on multiple devices, the testing of that, because it takes about 8 hours to have 8 hours of data collection. And, like, I have simulated stuff in the app for, when I'm doing, like, debug testing, that I can kind of, like, create a night's data and run my algorithms on it. But for actual testing, there's nothing you can really do other than wearing multiple watches, which is what I do. Like, when I'm doing extensive sleep, testing, like, I'll have all my watches on my wrist during the night, and I'm running it, 3 or 4 times. But, sort of in the same way I imagine for you with Overcast, like, there's a certain amount, if you just have to play lots of audio, because if you don't, you're never going to find all the weird audio issues or glitches or problems. But there's something that you can really do to speed that up, or compress that testing.
Yeah, basically. I mean, I just find ways to shove podcasts into more of my life. So like, and also to test out things like syncing. Like this, my syncing engine took forever to really figure out. I mean, it took me almost a year to really nail syncing. And one of the ways I started finally getting better at that was I started needing it more, because I started using an iPad to play podcasts in the kitchen, and I use my iPhone to play them everywhere else. So I was very frequently switching between multiple devices that would use the sync backend, and just by doing that myself, by needing that myself for a few months, I really fixed a ton of sync problems and got it to a pretty good place now. And so, yeah, I mean, it really is just a matter of just, again, it's like, if you only make apps that you will use a lot, this becomes a lot easier. If you don't make apps that use a lot, this, you're going to have to find other ways to do this effectively. But it really works out great for me. And I will, once again, go in briefly about beta testing also. And we, pretty sure we did a whole episode on it. If not, we will and we should, but I think we already did. I don't know. We have so many episodes now, I've kind of lost track. But I do rely a lot on beta testers to really do like a final check on the app. They aren't my first testers. I am my first tester, and I will usually use changes to the app for weeks or even months before I give it to anybody else to test. Just because I really want to make sure that I have a feel for it, make sure it's good, make sure it's the right choice, and then I will finally share it with testers like right before the public gets it. But basically, beta testers can help a little bit, not a ton. But a little bit. I will also add that what you mentioned earlier about your workflow about taking screenshots and then adding arrows and then adding them to OmniFocus and things like that. if you want to go off the deep end, there are lots of crazy tools and frameworks that automate that process to varying degrees and have all sorts of cool integrations. So like there are some like I made Bugshot Kit, which is basically shoved Bugshot into an app, and so you could do things like it will detect screenshots being taken and then automatically bring up a modal controller with the screenshot saying, "Here, mark this up and send it in to report a bug." And you can give that to all your testers, and you can use that yourself during your test process. And so you can basically have like easy or automated bug reporting right embedded into your app. And there's lots of ways to do this. I'm not going to recommend any particular one because I haven't really looked, but there are many of these exist now, and you can really go off the deep end with like the levels of integrations. You can have it like post to Slack and then make an entry in your bug tracker, and like all sorts of crazy things you can do now if you really want to get into all that stuff. So the options are pretty good for now for like tools and frameworks and things like that to automate like the tedious stuff. But for the real just using the app, really just using it a lot yourself is a very, very effective way to do it. Obviously, yes, I know automated things exist. Sorry, Casey, again, but just using your app yourself will show you so much, and will tell you so much, and we'll show you things like, this workflow is kind of clunky, or this animation doesn't really look right, or this I really need this text to be lighter when it's really sunny outside, or something like that. Like there's a large category of either problems or good and bad design decisions for which just using it yourself is really the only way to know and really the only way to test. And that isn't true for everything, obviously. Sorry again, Casey, but that's true for quite a lot that we do in our apps.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would say with beta testing, that's an important thing or another use for beta testing, is the importance of not overly preparing your beta testers for what for the app. So in terms of trying to giving them an experience that is similar to the experience that your App Store users are going to have. And so when they download the app and they're like, what do I do? Or this is really confusing. Like some of the best feedback I get from beta testers is sort of accidental, where they're not actually, they don't know it, but they're telling me something is fundamentally flawed or is really confusing, where they're asking a question that like it implies a fundamental misunderstanding about something. And that kind of feedback is always really good. And so I try, whenever I'm beta testing, to just almost like blindly send out the betas to people, where I'm not giving them too much preparation or like giving them step-by-step walkthroughs or details. It's very much like as though you just downloaded this from the App Store. Maybe you've seen a screenshot or two, maybe you've had a high-level discussion, but you're working it out just as you would as a regular user. And that's a great test because, as the developer of the app, obviously I know how everything works. Everything is intuitive to me because that's the way I made it. But it is often not the case for your users. And so one of the best uses for beta testing isn't, it's great when they find, actual bugs and issues and problems. But it's really useful for capturing those kind of like, it's like, if you're asking this question, I clearly have not communicated the purpose of this feature correctly, or I've hidden it in a weird way, or you think it should do something and it does the opposite. And those are the only thing that is almost exclusively possible to find in beta testing, because no matter how hard you try to kind of like reset your brain to what if I was a fresh user opening the application, it's kind of impossible. Where, like the current app I'm working on, I've been working on it essentially every day for months at this point. So I'm so in it that I just don't see, it's like I'm so far into the woods that I have no idea that there is a forest. Like all I have is trees. Like it is deep down into it. I mean, and maybe when I come back to it like I'll put the app to the side for a little bit and I'll come back to it in maybe a month. Maybe I will have that kind of fresh experience. But until that time, the only way I can get that is with beta testing. And so it is definitely a valuable and important aspect of that.
All right. And I guess we're going to see your new app pretty soon, right?
Yeah, it should be hopefully launching next week. So it should be kind of exciting. And I'm sure we'll talk about it on the show, how the launch went and kind of some of the details of it as the app goes. But it is very exciting to get to this point. And I will say, as it's like talking to all the other independent developers out there, it's like, I just put in the work, because there's definitely been times in this project where I was like, oh gosh, what have I gotten myself into? Maybe I should just like can this project and move on. But there is hope. Eventually we'll get there. Eventually we'll ship. And it is delightful when you get there.
Can I tell you a secret to the audience?
You can.
I know what this is, and I've used it, and it's really good. So look forward to it. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We're out of time this week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.